It was the year 722 AD. An army marched into the mountains. No victory horns sounded afterward. No messengers returned carrying good news or bad. No columns of wounded soldiers limped back toward the south. There was only silence, thick, heavy silence, as if the mountains themselves had closed their mouths after swallowing everyone who entered. On the maps of an empire accustomed to recording every triumph in ink and seal, something inexplicable appeared, a blank space, a void where reports should have existed, where spoils should have been counted, where prisoners should have been listed, where the familiar numbers of victory should have been written. But there was nothing, absolutely nothing. History prefers clarity. A great battle. Two armies are facing one another. One side victorious, the other defeated. But Covadonga does not follow that logic. No great battle was recorded. No fortress was besieged. No emperor was overthrown. No field of corpses was left behind for later generations to unearth. And yet an entire army vanished, as if it had never existed at all. This was not a scouting party that lost its way. Not a small detachment caught in an ambush. This was a force dispatched with the absolute confidence of an empire at the height of its power, an army that believed there was nowhere on the peninsula capable of resisting it. They advanced into the northern mountains, where fog clung to the cliffs and the paths were so narrow that maps became meaningless. And then they disappeared. No one returned to explain how they fought, how they lost, or why they withdrew. The mountains did not give them back, and history, in a rare moment, offers no clear answer either. According to the few lines the chronicles dared to write, the army faced only a few hundred people hiding inside a rocky cave. A few hundred, not thousands. Not a trained, fully equipped standing army. Just a small group of survivors, former soldiers of a fallen kingdom, farmers stripped of their land families, driven into the mountains, because behind them there was nothing left but occupation. One cave, a few hundred people, and a hostile land. Opposing them were tens of thousands of soldiers from an empire that had conquered nearly the entire Iberian Peninsula in just a few short years. Men accustomed to crossing deserts, sailing seas, and crushing ancient kingdoms as if history itself were an unlocked door. Men who believed that numbers, discipline, and the certainty of victory were enough to break any resistance. On paper, this was not a war. It was a cleanup operation, and then the numbers suddenly stopped mattering. No one agrees on how many soldiers entered Asturias that day. The figures conflict, exaggerate, or disappear altogether in the records. But everyone agrees on two things. First, the force that marched north was vastly greater than anything the people in the cave could have opposed by conventional means. And second, far more disturbing, that force never returned. This is the true paradox. Empires can forgive defeat. A loss can be explained, avenged, rewritten in a way that preserves honor. Disappearance is different. When an entire army enters a land and leaves no trace behind, it creates something more dangerous than a visible enemy. It creates doubt. It forces those in power to ask, not, how did we lose, but what happened there that made return impossible? That question led to a prolonged silence. No retaliatory expedition followed in the years after 722. No second army was dispatched to correct the mistake. No serious attempt was made to occupy those mountains for decades. For an empire that had never hesitated to send armies across seas and over ranges, this was abnormal. It revealed that Covadonga was not merely a tactical failure, but an experience they had no desire to repeat. So what truly happened in that valley? Why would a military superpower choose to turn away instead of returning with greater force and more careful planning? Why do the official chronicles devote only a few cold lines to this event, while far smaller victories are celebrated with pages of praise? And most importantly, what made an empire decide that the cost of those mountains was simply too high? Even for them, Covadonga is not the story of a great victory in the conventional sense. It did not collapse an empire overnight. It did not redraw the map in a single stroke, but it did something far more dangerous. It made an empire fear the blank spaces on its own maps, places where power could not be measured by numbers or straight lines. And once that fear appeared, history began to turn in another direction, because this is not a story about a victory. This is a story about fear. After Covadonga, people often ask the same question: how could a few hundred people make an entire army disappear? But that question comes later. Before the tragedy unfolded, a more important truth had been planted, one that had been in place for more than a decade. It was the truth of an empire that did not know how to stop. In the year 711 AD, when the first sails crossed the narrow strait between North Africa and Europe, no one on the Iberian Peninsula understood that what they were witnessing was not a raid, but the beginning of a flood. This was not a probing force. It was the spearhead of a machine that had been running non-stop for decades, a machine accustomed to expansion, accustomed to victory, accustomed to seeing every land ahead as an inevitable part of its future. They crossed Gibraltar so quickly that history barely had time to record it. Coastal cities changed flags before they even understood what was happening. But the truly decisive moment did not occur on the shore. It happened deep inland, at a river whose name would later be whispered like a curse Guadalet. In a single afternoon, the Visigothic kingdom, which had endured for 3 centuries since the Roman Empire's retreat, collapsed, not because it was outnumbered, not because it lacked weapons, but because it had rotted from within. When the last king fell into the mud of the river while traders stood and watched, what died with him was not just a man, but the entire power structure of a kingdom. There was no heir, no contingency plan. No one was left to give the order to keep fighting. From that moment on, for the conquerors, this was no longer war. War implies resistance, costly battles, and victories paid for in blood. But in Iberia, after Guadalete, everything felt more like a cleanup. Major cities opened their gates. Classes oppressed under the old regime chose silence or cooperation. Roads were open, granaries full, and the victors advanced so quickly that even they began to believe nothing could slow them down. In just a few short years, the map was redrawn, as if someone had pulled a straight line from south to north. Toledo, Seville, Cordoba, names that had once defined power fell with such speed that resistance began to look like a rare anomaly, a minor flaw in an otherwise perfect process. Commanders no longer asked, "Can we take this place?" but only, "How long will it take?" This is the most dangerous mindset an empire can have. When victory becomes routine, caution becomes unnecessary. Commanders grow accustomed to large numbers, to overwhelming force, to seeing maps as flat surfaces, to be conquered by marching straight ahead. They measure land with ink, and rulers not with fog, slick stone, or nameless paths. Within that picture, Asturias appeared as an irritation, a damp, impoverished mountain region with no great cities, no significant treasure, no vital trade routes. On the commander's maps, it looked like a stain at the edge of the page, a statistical error, to be wiped away when time allowed. No one believed it deserved priority. No one believed it could become a threat. And so it was left behind. Reports from the north were skimmed. A few rebel bands. Some people flee into the mountains, not worth committing regular troops. Someone laughed and used a phrase history would later remember: wild donkeys. A throwaway remark, yet one that revealed the entire disease of arrogance. It was not just contempt for the weak, but the quiet conviction that the game was already over, that everything else was merely a matter of time. And time, they believed, was on their side. Winter would come. Cold, hunger, and isolation would do the work of swords. No need to send a large army into narrow, wet mountain paths. No need to risk terrain where cavalry was useless. Why worry about a few hundred people hiding in caves when the entire peninsula was already in hand? But it was here that the first mistake was planted silently and almost invisibly. Because when an empire grows used to advancing without resistance, it begins to confuse silence with submission. It forgets that some places do not fight back because they have accepted defeat, but because they are waiting. It forgets that not every war is fought on open plains, where numbers and discipline decide the outcome. Asturias did not resist in those early years, and that was taken as proof of weakness. No one stopped to ask why this poor region had not fully surrendered like the others. No one asked what was happening in the fog of its narrow valleys, because the empire had grown accustomed to not needing to ask. And that is the most dangerous moment in the life of any power, the moment when questions disappear, when assumptions go unchallenged, when the strong believe that everything ahead will look exactly like everything behind. When an empire stops asking questions, history whispers. History begins preparing its punishment. The conquerors did not realize that while they were busy redrawing maps and planning their next campaigns in the north, in a land they considered irrelevant, time was being used differently, not to surrender, but to prepare. And when they finally decided to return and clean up that remaining stain, they would carry with them all the dangerous habits of an empire that did not know how to stop marching straight into a place where their flat maps no longer meant anything. Pelayo did not enter history as a chosen hero. He entered it as a survivor. And in the years immediately following the catastrophe of 711, survival was not an honor, but a burden. Pelayo was a royal bodyguard of the Visigothic kingdom, a man who stood close enough to the throne to smell the iron and sweat of power. He was not a king, nor a man plotting to become one. He was charged with protecting the throne, and when the kingdom collapsed, that duty died with it, leaving him exposed in a world where old oaths no longer had a place. Pelayo was present at Guadalete. He saw the lines break. He saw entire wings stand still when they should have charged. He saw the last king vanish into mud and blood, leaving behind not a body to be honored, but a lethal vacuum of power. There was no heroic last stand, no final rallying cry, only chaos, betrayal, and a cold realization spreading through the minds of those still standing it was over. Pelayo did not die there. He did not fall like the men history would later celebrate. He lived, and because he lived, he ran, not out of cowardice, but because there was no one left to protect. When the center of power was torn apart, survivors were no longer warriors or nobles. They became targets. Pelayo withdrew step by step, moving through lands where banners changed so quickly that the people scarcely knew who ruled them. He watched cities open their gates, noble families change their oaths, and men who once gave orders learn how to bow. In this new world, Pelayo was an inconvenient remnant, too close to the old regime to be trusted, too valuable to be killed outright. And so he was taken, not in crude chains, but by something far more refined. Pelayo was brought to Cordoba, the new center of power, taking shape not as a prisoner in a dungeon, but as a well-treated hostage. This is how empires behave when they are confident. They do not need torture. They do not need executions. They keep former enemies close, feed them, let them live, and force them to watch the complete collapse of the world they once served. Cordoba was a gilded cage. High walls, carefully tended gardens, bright corridors filled with light. Pelayo was not beaten. He was not starved. But each passing day, he was forced to watch familiar symbols of Visigothic power disappear. New laws were issued. Former allies appeared in new roles, speaking new words, swearing new loyalties. The empire did not try to break Pelayo with pain. It did so with time, with the normalization of defeat. Through those years, Pelayo remained silent. He did not rebel. He did not call out. He waited, though he was not certain what he was waiting for. Perhaps an opportunity, perhaps a quicker death than this slow erosion of self. And then a piece of news arrived, and it cut straight through the layer of resignation he had wrapped around himself. News of his sister. Munusa, the ruler of the north, was not merely an imperial official. He was the embodiment of soft control, of legitimizing power through arrangements and alliances. And he wanted Pelayo's sister, a marriage in the language of the victors, a political arrangement wrapped in the vocabulary of peace. But to Pelayo, it was not a marriage. It was a full stop. Not merely personal humiliation, not merely family grief, but the systematic erasure of a bloodline, a way to dissolve the Visigothic legacy into the new order until no one remembered it had ever existed. In Cordoba, Pelayo had learned how to endure, but this news accomplished what no speech and no torture ever could. It made him understand that if he continued living this way, he would become an accomplice in his own erasure. The empire did not need him dead. It needed him to disappear quietly, legally, without disturbance. And that was something Pelayo could not accept. That moment marked the transformation. The old bodyguard, the silent survivor, died. In his place stood someone else, stripped of illusions about negotiation or adaptation. Pelayo did not beg. He did not send protests. He understood that every official path was closed. Only one option remained, the option every empire fears most because it cannot control its escape. The details of Pelayo's escape were never recorded. No one knows whom he bribed, whom he struck down, or how he disguised himself to leave Cordoba. History only knows the outcome. One day, Pelayo was simply gone. A hostage vanished from a gilded cage without leaving a clear trace, and with that disappearance, something dangerous began to take shape. Not an immediate rebellion, not a loud declaration, but a hardened will forged by defeat and humiliation. Pelayo did not flee south where other powers might shelter him. He did not seek foreign courts to ask for aid. He ran north toward lands the empire considered unworthy of attention. He ran to Asturias, not because it was safe, but because it was the last place where he could still choose his own fate. In Pelayo's mind, this escape was not about survival. It was about preventing something worse than death. And from that moment on, he understood a cold truth. If he failed, history would not remember him. But if he stood still, history would erase him without lifting a hand. Pelayo ran north, not as a man with a plan, but as someone who had cut off every path back. Behind him stood Cordoba, with its bright walls and a new order already complete. Ahead of him lay a peninsula that had changed hands so quickly that memory itself had not yet caught up with who it now belonged to. He moved through lands where new banners hung from watchtowers, where new laws were read aloud in calm voices, and where the people had learned a skill more important than fighting silence. That silence followed Pelayo the entire way. He passed through villages once owned by noble families, now shuttered before nightfall. He saw eyes watching him through cracks in doors, quick, cautious, then disappearing. No one asked who he was. No one asked where he was going. And most importantly, no one dared invite him to stay. In a country freshly conquered, hospitality had become a deadly risk. Sheltering a fugitive was no longer an act of kindness, but a suspended sentence hanging over an entire household. Pelayo understood this. He did not blame them. He knew this fear because he had lived inside it himself for years. He moved fast, stopped rarely, and avoided main roads and places with checkpoints. With each passing day, the world behind him grew more foreign, while what lay ahead remained an unnamed blur. The empire had won so quickly that it did not need to control every corner, but it was precisely those gaps that became the only paths Pelayo could take. As he moved farther north, the land began to change. Wide fields gave way to slopes. Straight roads fractured into winding trails. The air grew colder, heavier with moisture. Rain was no longer an event, but a constant condition. This was not a land of great cities or palaces. This was Asturias, where there was more stone than people, where the soil was so poor that no large army would bother to linger. Yet it was that very poverty that offered Pelayo something he could not find in the south space to choose. Here, imperial presence was thin. Power existed on paper and in rumor, but rarely in physical form. The people were used to living off the mountains, used to surviving when harvests failed. They were not wealthy, but they were accustomed to not waiting for rescue. In narrow valleys and scattered hamlets, Pelayo began to see faces like his own. former soldiers who had drifted away after Guadalete, carrying wounds and bitterness. Farmers were stripped of their land when new rulers arrived and new laws took effect. Families pushed into the mountains because there was no longer room for them below. They did not gather in large crowds. They appeared one by one as if their very existence required discretion. At first they traveled with Pelayo only for short stretches, not because they believed in rebellion, but because moving together was safer than walking alone. But then something began to shift. News spread in ways no chronicle would ever record, not through letters or proclamations, but through whispers by hearth fires. That someone had escaped from Cordoba, that he had not bowed, that he was heading into the mountains, not to hide, but to stay. Pelayo did not call for followers. He made no promises. He spoke neither of victory nor restoration. He simply kept moving, and others kept following. With each step northward, the group grew larger and more fragile. They had no shared uniform, no clear symbols, no carefully drawn plan. The only thing they shared was the feeling of having been pushed to the edge of the old world, where every option was bad and standing still was more dangerous than moving forward. In the eyes of the new rulers, these people were not worth concern. They had no cities, no granaries, no clearly defined territory. They were nothing more than a scattered collection of those who refused to adapt. Somewhere, some official reading reports from the north shrugged and reused the familiar dismissive term, wild donkeys, a phrase that sounded harmless yet perfectly captured how the empire viewed this emerging danger not as an enemy but as a temporary irritation. Pelayo and those with him never heard that contempt. All they knew was that behind them there was nothing left to lose. Ahead of them were cold mountains, damp caves, and an uncertain future, and under those conditions a community began to form not from lofty ideals, but from necessity. They shared scarce food. They shared knowledge of hidden paths. They shared memories of what had been lost. Slowly, what had begun as a solitary flight turned into an unplanned gathering, a group driven into a corner and forced to remain together. Asturias did not welcome them with safety. It welcomed them with a trial. Cold hunger and isolation filtered out the weak of resolve. But those who remained, those who pushed deeper into the mountains, began to rediscover something the South had forgotten. In places where power cannot easily reach, people still have the chance to decide who they will become. And it was in that poor, cold land of stone and fog that the label wild donkeys began to attach itself to something new, still unnamed, but already moving in the same direction. Asturias did not give Pelayo a fortress. It gave him a question, and that question did not exist on any map the generals were used to reading. Among damp valleys and sheer rock faces, Pelayo slowed his pace, not from exhaustion, but because for the first time since leaving Cordoba, he was no longer just fleeing. He was choosing. Covadonga was not the most beautiful place, nor was it the most spacious. It was a shallow cave opening onto a narrow gorge so high and steep that rain did not flow downward, but fell straight onto stone and shattered into mist. The air was perpetually damp, the cold seeped into bone, and the ground was slick, as if the mountain itself were trying to push intruders back to where they came from. Anyone looking for a safe refuge would not choose Covadonga. Anyone seeking a place to hide for a long time would pass it by. But Pelayo was not looking to hide. He was looking for a place to stop. Stopping did not mean standing still. For Pelayo, stopping meant turning terrain into a decision. He looked at the narrow gorge and did not see confinement. He saw a bottleneck. He looked at the shallow cave and did not see fragility. He saw a stone canopy that could shield. He looked at the height and the slick incline and did not see a disadvantage. He saw heavy footsteps, slow, familiar formations, unraveling before they could even deploy. Covadonga was not a refuge. It was a trap that needed no doors, no complex mechanisms, only an enemy who believed it was not a trap. And what gave Pelayo confidence was not vague intuition, but something he possessed in greater measure than any Umayyad commander at the time. From 718 to 722, no one hurried at Covadonga. There were no horns, no court orders, no pressure to act immediately. The empire to the south was occupied with larger matters, collecting taxes, reorganizing territory, and preparing new campaigns beyond other mountain ranges farther north. In their eyes, this region had been left to winter and hunger to deal with, and that gap, the gap of contempt, became Pelayo's most valuable asset. Time allowed him to do what fugitives rarely can observe. Pelayo learned every footpath leading into the valley, every rock that surfaced during heavy rain, every patch of soft ground that could collapse under the weight of many men. He did not draw maps on parchment or leather. He drew them in his mind, using the memories of those who had lived here long before chronicles existed. Shepherds, woodcutters, people who knew where the mountain stayed silent and where it answered back. Preparation began quietly, not like a military project, but as a natural extension of survival. Side paths were widened just enough for someone familiar with the terrain to move quickly, yet narrow enough to render large formations useless. Boulders were pried loose from slopes, not to fall immediately, but to wait. Massive tree trunks were dragged to high points, not to build barricades, but to be ready to become something else when needed. Everything was done slowly, carefully, so as not to draw attention, so that anyone passing through would see nothing but another poor, desolate mountain region, like so many others. Those who followed Pelayo learned how to wait. For many of them, waiting was harder than fighting, but they had learned a lesson from the fall of the Old Kingdom, charging an empire on terrain where that empire was strongest was suicide. At Covadonga, they did not practice formations on open ground. They practiced moving through fog, standing still long enough to blend into stone, listening to the difference between footsteps made by one man and those made by hundreds. Pelayo spoke little during those years. He did not give speeches about restoration. He did not promise victory. He repeated only one thing: if they were discovered too early, everything would end. And so their greatest discipline was not the discipline of attack, but the discipline of restraint. No raids, no harassment, no traces left behind. Let the enemy believe this land was exactly as they assumed, poor cold, and not worth attention. During that time, Covadonga became more than a location. It became a habit, a rhythm of life. People grew accustomed to waking in fog, to cold that cut the skin, to doing everything discreetly. Each day that passed without enemy soldiers was a successful day. Each winter that came and went was a reminder that if nature itself could kill men, then men only needed to learn how to stand on its side. There were things about Covadonga that even those living there did not speak aloud. Whispers about how sound echoed inside the cave, how footsteps bounced back and disoriented outsiders. Observations about how heavy rain softened certain patches of earth, while rock elsewhere remained firm. No one called it a miracle. No one wrote it into doctrine. It existed only as unofficial knowledge passed through glances and gestures more than words. Later chronicles would describe Covadonga as a point on a map, a place where a battle occurred. But during those years of preparation, it was not a point. It was a process of turning disadvantage into advantage, poverty into camouflage, and time into a weapon. Pelayo understood that when the enemy finally decided to return and clean up this mountain region, they would bring all their old habits with them: faith in numbers, faith in speed, faith in flat maps. And Covadonga was ready to prove that those habits were not always correct. There are details about how Pelayo chose the cave, about how the paths were arranged, about why that specific gorge became the focal point, that the chronicles either ignore or glide over in vague lines. Some things were never written down, perhaps because the writers did not understand them, or because they dared not claim certainty. But they existed quietly like the mountains themselves. And when the moment came, the things not written on the map would prove their worth. There are things about Covadonga that the chronicles do not explain. We will return to them, In early 722 AD, the waiting ended, not with a surprise attack, but with the sound of organized footsteps approaching from the south. The Umayyad forces finally entered Asturias, no longer treating the mountains as a stain to be left for weather and hunger to erase. This time, they came to close a file that had been neglected for too long. To them, this was still not a real war, but a delayed administrative action, a final cleanup before returning to more important matters. The column advanced slowly, not out of fear, but because the terrain demanded it. Narrow paths, fractured formations, forcing cavalry behind infantry, compressing ranks that were accustomed to space. Yet confidence remained intact. They were numerous, they were armed, and they believed that mere presence, applied with sufficient weight, would cause those hiding in the mountains to dissolve without a fight. The one difference in this campaign was a man who wore no armor and carried no sword, yet was escorted with care. Bishop Appas, a bishop of the old order, a man of Visigothic blood, and one who had chosen to stand with the new regime. His presence was no accident. This was not only a military operation, it was a political message. Appas understood his role. He had not come to threaten, but to persuade, not to spill blood, but to close a matter with words. When the army halted before the gorge leading into Covadonga, Appas was allowed to move forward with only a small escort. The air tightened. Pelayo's followers remained silent in the mist, watching the valley below, where imperial power was gathering, waiting for a command. Appas called out, not in the voice of a victor, but in the tone of an elder offering counsel. He spoke of reality, of what had happened to the Visigothic kingdom, of the futility of resistance. He named cities that had fallen, armies far larger than this one that had been crushed. He did not insult. He did not threaten. He posed a question that sounded reasonable. How could a few hundred people in the mountains succeed where an entire kingdom had failed? This was imperial logic distilled into an offer. Step out. Accept the new order. Live. Pelayo could retain his position in these mountains, under the protection of Cordoba. No blood needed to be shed. History could close this chapter quietly. For those standing in the fog, it was a clear exit, a way to avoid the almost certain death that would follow open conflict. Pelayo listened in silence. He stood at the mouth of the cave rock, and darkness behind him, a valley packed with soldiers before him. In that moment, he understood this was more than negotiation. It was the Empire's final attempt to reduce this confrontation to a footnote, an issue resolved by paperwork rather than blood. If he agreed, Covadonga would never become a name worth remembering. It would vanish like hundreds of minor revolts before it. But Pelayo did not answer with calculations. He did not argue numbers or odds. When he spoke, it was with the voice of a man who had gone too far to return. He spoke of what Appas had not mentioned: faith. Not faith in immediate victory, but in the meaning of standing firm when everything else was gone. He invoked the image of the mustard seed, so small it is dismissed, yet capable of growing beyond expectation. Not as a miracle, but as a declaration that value is not measured by initial size. In that moment, Appas knew his words had failed. Pelayo did not refuse because he believed he would win a battle. He refused because he believed that not surrendering mattered more than surviving within the new order. Between the logic of empire and the desperate conviction of those driven into a corner, there was no common ground left. Appas turned back toward the army. No long report was needed. The Umayyad ranks read the outcome on his face. Patience already thin vanished. From that instant, everything shifted. Words were put away. Plans were replaced with orders. War drums began to beat, striking the rock walls and echoing back like a warning. Inside the narrow gorge, the air grew dense. Pelayo's followers tightened their grip on crude weapons, fully aware that there was no retreat left. Behind them stood sheer rock. Before them loomed an empire preparing to press down. No one spoke it aloud, but all understood that this moment had been awaited for years. The silent days, the rain-soaked nights, the loosened stones, all of it had been leading here. From the moment Appas turned away, there was only one way out of the valley, and that path would no longer be decided by words. The drums sounded before the arrows flew. The noise slammed into the rock walls, bounced back layered over itself, until the entire valley vibrated like a massive chest holding its breath. The order was passed down, short, sharp, familiar to men who had won hundreds of battles fire. Umayyad archers stepped forward, forming ranks at the bottom of the gorge. They looked up toward the cave mouth, where blurred silhouettes stood motionless behind the mist. The distance was not far, but the angle was wrong. Steep, narrow, unlike any battlefield they had known, but it did not slow them. They had fired into fortifications, into dense formations, into charging cavalry. A rocky cave was not a threat. Bowstrings were drawn tight. The arrows were released. They surged upward, forming a brief black cloud against the gray sky. And then almost at once, something went wrong. The arrows did not fly cleanly into the cave as expected. They struck stone. They hit the shallow rock overhang that jutted forward. A dry cracking sound echoed, not the familiar sound of flesh pierced, but of metal and wood slamming into hard rock. And then the thing no one expected happened. The arrows came back. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to turn a single volley into a lethal moment. Splintered shafts, bent iron heads, suddenly reversed direction and rained down into the valley, where archers and infantry stood packed shoulder to shoulder. Men screamed, not the roar of a charge, but cries of shock, pain, and confusion. One man fell, then another. Blood appeared where safety was supposed to be. Chaos began there. Officers shouted new orders, but their voices were swallowed by the echo. The gorge twisted sound, breaking commands into useless fragments. The front ranks hesitated not out of fear of the men in the cave, but because they did not understand what was happening. They looked up, raised their shields, and tried to avoid arrows falling back down like a warped storm. That was the moment Pelayo had been waiting for. There was no horn, no ritual, just a small motion, almost invisible in the fog. But those closest to him saw it. They saw his hand drop, and Covadonga woke up. From the cave mouth, figures surged forward, not in straight lines, but like water breaking through a dam. Swords, axes, crude spears, and heavy stones came down at once. But that was only the part the Umayyads could see. The more dangerous part came from where they could not. From higher slopes, where thick mist concealed all movement, massive rocks began to slide. First one, then another, then a chain of them. They did not fall freely. They rolled, collided, shattered, gathered speed, dragging earth and timber with them. The sound of stone smashing into stone thundered through the confined space, leaving men below, unable to tell what was natural and what was an attack. The Umayyad formation, already compressed by the terrain, became a mass that could no longer turn or breathe. Those in the rear did not know what was happening at the front and continued pushing forward out of habit. Those ahead tried to pull back but had nowhere to go. Horses panicked, slipping on wet rock, throwing riders to the ground. When one fell, others followed tangled reins, turning cavalry strength into a deadly burden. Pelayo and his followers did not stop. They struck fast, close, then vanished behind rock and trees. They did not try to hold ground. They aimed to shatter rhythm. A blow against a banner officer, a cut at a bridle, a stone dropped from above, no need for precision, only timing. Every small action served the same purpose, stripping the army below of its ability to organize itself. Within minutes, the order collapsed. Not because the Umayyads were weak, but because they were forced to fight in a way they had never been trained for. On open plains, they were a machine. In this gorge, they were a crowd crushed together, attacked from every direction, unable to see where the enemy was. At the center of the chaos, Pelayo appeared and vanished like a shadow. He did not shout slogans. He did not seek a heroic duel. He struck where a former royal bodyguard understood best the weak points of power itself. When a commander fell, panic spread faster than any arrow. When a banner went down, Those nearby began to suspect they had been abandoned, but all of this was still only the beginning. Covadonga had not been built to kill men one by one, it had been built to break them. And when an army is broken in a space that offers no escape, death arrives in another form, not through precise blows, but through weight. Men were shoved to the ground, men trampled, men crushed against rock walls, while hundreds of bodies continued to press from behind. Cries for help echoed through the valley, but no one could tell whether they were commands or screams. Sound twisted, bounced back, repeating itself, until everything felt like a looping nightmare. In the fog, Umayyad soldiers could no longer see their enemy. They saw a falling rock, collapsing comrades' ranks, dissolving without understanding why. For a brief moment, it seemed recovery might be possible. A group of officers tried to gather men, carve out space, and reform lines, but the gorge offered no mercy. Another wave of stone crashed down, shattering the final attempt. Those still standing looked around, and for the first time in their lives, saw no way forward and no way back. That was when true fear arrived. Not the fear of losing a battle, but the fear of being trapped in a place that made no sense. Men who once believed they were part of an unstoppable force now found themselves reduced to isolated individuals fighting to survive inside a trap they had not recognized until it closed. Pelayo did not order a pursuit. He did not need to. Covadonga handled the rest. Mountain stone, fog, and terrain continued their work, impartial, relentless. The men in the cave and on the slopes needed only to ensure that no new order could form. As the sun climbed higher and weak light reached the valley floor, the scene below no longer resembled a familiar battlefield. There were no clear sides, no lines, only chaos where an army had lost its original shape. The survivors began to realize that the worst was not yet over, because if moving forward meant death, and standing still also meant death, only one option remained: run. And when they turned to flee, Covadonga prepared to enter its next chapter. When the Umayyad formation began to turn back, Covadonga offered no chance for correction. In a confined space where every movement was amplified and every mistake multiplied, retreat ceased to be an organized command. It became a survival reflex. The drums and shouted orders disappeared. All that remained were boots slipping on wet stone metal, clashing in panic, and the ragged breathing of men who were realizing for the first time that they were being hunted by the terrain itself. Stone and timber continued to fall, not in a steady rhythm, not according to any predictable pattern. One boulder dropped, then a brief silence, then an entire sequence followed. Each impact sent shockwaves racing through the gorge, knocking fleeing men off balance below. Those who fell did not face death only from rock, but from their own comrades. In such a narrow space, one stumble could pull an entire line down, with it turning retreat into a cascading collapse that could not be stopped. The gorge became a slaughterhouse without blades. No precise strikes were needed, only weight, momentum, and panic. Formations trained to advance could no longer pivot to withdraw. Numbers, once a source of pride, became a lethal burden. Every additional body pressing from behind increased the pressure on those ahead. There was no room to dodge, no place to hide. Falling stone and timber did not distinguish rank or courage. They fell wherever men stood. In the heart of the chaos, General Alcama attempted what any experienced commander would. He tried to carve out space to create a temporary rally point where order might be restored. Those near him saw the familiar gestures. A raised hand shouted commands, an effort to pull the army back into something that could still fight. But in this gorge, a general's authority shrank to something fragile. Orders traveled no farther than a few meters. Sound was swallowed, bounced back, twisted into meaningless echoes. There are many ways a general can die in war. Alcama died the way Covadonga allowed, not in a heroic duel, not beneath a distant rain of arrows, but inside the dense chaos of his own army. A horse slipping, a blow from above, a rolling stone. The chronicles disagree, and perhaps it does not matter. What matters is that when word of his fall spread, even as panicked whispers, it severed the final thread, holding the army together. The formation broke completely. It was no longer a force, but a mass of people moving in a single direction out of the gorge. The stronger shoved forward. The weaker were left behind. In that flight, concepts of honor discipline and imperial order vanished. Only instinct remained. And instinct in this terrain was a terrible guide. Those fortunate enough to escape the gorge first believed the nightmare was over. They glanced back, saw mist swallowing most of what had happened, and assumed that if they could just go farther, climb a few more slopes, they would find a familiar road leading south. But Covadonga did not end at the gorge. It extended outward, linking into a network of unstable slopes and valleys where the ground had been saturated by days of rain. During the retreat, exhaustion and panic blinded the column to signs the locals had known for generations: soft earth, fractured stone, paths meant for one man, not thousands running in desperation. Then along a narrow mountainside, the ground began to move, not like an explosion, but like a long, deep groan. The landslide began. At first, small sections it slipped carrying mud and rock. Then an entire section of the slope shifted as if the mountain itself were breathing. Those in front had no time to react. Those behind continued pushing forward. And in that moment, nature did what no army could do so quickly. It erased them. Earthstone and tree trunks crashed down, sealing the path, sweeping men and horses with them. Screams rose and were swallowed. The column was cut in half. Those still standing above stared down at a moving mass of destruction where their comrades had been. There was no rescue, no turning back. The only option was to keep running, abandoning everything that had just happened. Later chronicles spoke of tens of thousands dead, perhaps exaggeration, perhaps not, but all accounts agree on one thing: however they phrase it, very few, if any, returned. There were no detailed reports, no complete casualty lists, only prolonged silence from the north, a silence that forced those in Cordoba to stop and ask what had happened to their army. Covadonga sent no message. It did not need to. The absence of survivors said enough. An army was dispatched and then vanished, not in a single battle, but through a sequence of events that no survivor could piece together into a coherent account. For an empire, this was the worst outcome imaginable. There was no clear defeat to analyze, no enemy victory to avenge. Only a land that once entered did not give men back. And so Covadonga became more than a place. It became a memory half event, half warning, a location general mentioned in quieter voices, a mountain region marked in the mind, if not on maps, as a place to avoid, not because it was rich, but because the cost of conquering it could not be measured. An accident, or something prepared in advance. History offers no definitive answer. The chronicles speak of nature's intervention, rain landslides, collapsing ground, but they also admit that everything happened at the right moment, in the right place, to the right army. Between those explanations lies a gap, like the blank space on maps, after 722, a space where coincidence and preparation overlap impossible to separate. The only certainty is this: after Covadonga, no Umayyad army ever again pushed deep into those mountains with the intention of permanent occupation. The mountains had done their work, and the memory of what they could do endured longer than any victory or defeat. After Covadonga, silence was no longer anonymous. It had consequences, and those consequences arrived faster than any victory song ever could, while the northern gorges were still swallowing the last traces of the massacre. News seeped down into the plains. In the most distorted and frightening way possible, no official reports, no lists of survivors, only fragmented whispers from a handful of men who had somehow escaped the hell of stone and fog. They spoke of an army that vanished. They spoke of mountains collapsing. They spoke of fighting no enemy at all, only terrain and panic. And they spoke with the voice of men who no longer believed they had lost a battle, but that they had wandered into a place that should not have existed. Munusa understood this sooner than most. As days passed, without messengers from the north, as rumors replaced orders. He read the sign. No instinct-driven politician could ignore his authority, and Asturias was finished. Not because Pelayo had declared anything grand, but because fear had changed hands. Villages that had once been silent began to look different. Eyes that once lowered now held steady. Munuza knew that staying meant isolation and then being hunted in the very land he had once ruled. He fled south, carrying whatever he could, hoping to put distance between himself and the mountains before the story of Covadonga could turn into action. But Pelayo did not grant him that distance. The men once dismissed as wild donkeys now moved faster along paths they knew better than any official ever could. The final confrontation was not a great battle. It was brief, cold, and decisive. Munuza was killed or captured and executed depending on the source. History does not concern itself with the details. What matters is that the last symbol of Umayyad power in Asturias disappeared. The void left behind was not filled by a new army. It was filled by a collective decision. Pelayo, once a fugitive, was lifted on shields, according to the old rites of his ancestors. There was no glittering crown, no grand liturgy, only calloused hands and a rough consensus. If this place was to exist, someone had to stand in its name. And so Pelayo became king, not because he had conquered land, but because he had proven that this land could remain unconquered. The kingdom of Asturias was born that way, small, poor, and surrounded by a far greater power. On Umayyad maps, it was not worth detailing. No wealthy cities, no major trade routes, no clear economic reason to risk another attempt. And after what had happened, there was another reason as well, one not written but understood the psychological cost. The empire did not return to Asturias with the intention of long-term occupation. Raids continued, short campaigns were launched, but an invisible boundary had been drawn. The northern mountains became not worth it, not because they were useless, but because they did not obey the familiar rules of imperial warfare. They did not allow quick victories. They did not allow easy control. And most importantly, they did not allow failure to be forgotten. It was within that neglected space that the seeds of the Reconquista were planted, not as a grand centuries-long plan, but as a survival habit. Pelayo and those who followed him did not rush into the plains to reclaim everything. They held the mountains. They held the passes. They learned to survive through deliberate poverty. Their choices were not always noble. Lands were abandoned, communities displaced. Brutal decisions were made to create the distance between themselves and the empire. But that was the price of survival when facing an enemy vastly stronger. Pelayo did not live to see the outcome of the chain of events he set in motion. He died in 737, not on a battlefield, but within the fragile peace of his small kingdom. Yet his legacy does not lie in years ruled or territory held. It lies in a dangerous precedent that an empire can be stopped not by defeating it everywhere, but by making it choose not to return to one specific place. Asturias did not win by expanding. It won by becoming not worth conquering. And from that choice, European history began to follow a long, winding path, bloody, compromised, but irreversible. The Reconquista was not a single campaign, but a series of decisions repeated across generations, all tracing back to one moment in the fog of 722. Today, when people look back at Covadonga, they may argue over numbers, details, and over how miraculous what happened truly was, but those debates miss the central point. Covadonga was not just a place where a battle occurred. It was where fear was born, not in the hearts of the weak, but in the minds of the strong, and that fear shaped how an empire looked northward for decades. Some places do not need to be conquered. They only need to make others never dare to return.